Lord, as you have come into our hearts, help us to let you out through our hands and through our mouths. Amen. Amen. I am sure that there are people who are self-confident and always feel up to the task ahead, who are certain that they are more than adequate to handle whatever comes along. I am sure that there are people like that, but I'm not one of them. If you are one of those, bless you. But I do not know what that feels like. See, I feel that I have somehow fooled enough people to get by in life so far. But tomorrow, who knows? I may be found out. But in the meantime, I will answer God's call to help spread the message of God's love, just as in our baptismal vows. My response is, I will, with God's help. And as I read it, the Bible is filled with people like me. In today's lessons, we meet 3 such people. In each of our readings, we find someone who has been called by God for a task that they think they are not qualified for. The task is to be a messenger, to help spread the message that God is love, that God forgives, that God is mercy and grace. God calls and makes God's presence known in ways that are personal for each person that's called. God appears to each of us, whether we recognize it or not. When we do recognize it and answer, lives are changed. We become messengers, whether by our words or by the way we live our lives. Isaiah saw God as a king sitting on a throne. This happens in the year that King Uzziah died. The book of 2 Kings in the Bible tells us that King Uzziah had been a king for 52 years, and that he was a good king. This was the only king that Isaiah had ever known. So when the king died, it must have shaken Isaiah with a fear of the future. We had a good king, but what's this next one going to be like? God appeared to Isaiah as a king. The image of a powerful, good king was an image that Isaiah understood. But Isaiah knew that he was a sinful man, and he believed that no sinful man can look at God and live. Isaiah confessed his sinfulness, and instead of dying, he was told that his sins were forgiven. Isaiah understood that it was God's mercy that allowed him to live, so he volunteered to be a messenger for God. Isaiah knew that he was sinful and unworthy, but his epiphany was that God does forgive out of God's abundant mercy. And when that mercy was accepted, Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." In his confession and acceptance of forgiveness, Isaiah becomes a model for all of us. God called, and Isaiah responded even though he felt unqualified. Paul said that he was the most unqualified of all the disciples because he had persecuted other disciples for their belief. persecuting others for their beliefs seems to me to be an exercise in fear and weakness. It comes from a place in someone's heart that is filled with evil and hate. It's a place of darkness. And Paul was working in that darkness when God appeared to him in a blinding light of self-awareness. Jesus is the light of the world, and when he came to Paul, it was as a light of understanding. Paul understood power over others, and God gave him came to him exerting a great power that caused Paul to reconsider all that he had learned before. When Paul came to understand what he had seen on that road to Damascus, he became a super disciple. He was the ultimate messenger for God, even though he felt the least qualified for the job. Paul knew that it was the saving grace of God that had allowed him to live through that smackdown that God had given him. And Paul never ceased to spread God's message of mercy and forgiveness. This was a man who had not shown mercy to those he persecuted. His epiphany was that mercy should be shown to all because God offers it to all. Peter was a fisherman. He knew fish. He could work all night with just his partners and for company, and he didn't have to talk very much. So he was not a very good choice to be God's messenger. And he had just had a particularly bad night of fishing when Jesus showed up. Peter was cleaning his nets that had only caught debris. He was thinking about how he was going to go home and tell his wife that there'd be nothing to eat today. So he was at a low point, and Jesus asked for his help to deliver God's message to the crowd of people that were there. Peter responded, and he listened to Jesus as he preached his message. But it was only after Jesus told him to go into the deeper water to fish that Peter saw God in the boatload of fish. See, fish is what Peter knew. And that's where he saw God. Peter had been literally working in the dark when Jesus brought him into the light. Jesus' lesson was that that to fully see God, Peter had to do more than just listen to the message. He had to go deeper. He had to show trust in Jesus and follow his command. Peter was willing to help deliver the message even though he was himself a sinner and felt unworthy of the task. Jesus showed him that God could produce a greater catch than he could ever even imagine. And his initial fear was replaced by reverence when he recognized who Jesus was. Jesus' call to him was accepted, and Peter left the great catch, his boat, and his previous life behind as he accepted God's call to catch people. Jesus called him, and after Peter's confession of his sinfulness, Jesus forgave his sins so that Peter could become a messenger of God's mercy and grace. These lessons recall to me the hymn Amazing Grace. It's been on my mind for some time. It's been to me a story that this song tells the story of mercy and grace that these lessons demonstrate. You see, the story goes that John Newton was a slave trader. You might say he was a catcher of people, quite literally. On a sea voyage with a cargo of human beings, a particularly bad storm came up, and much of the human cargo was lost as the ship was tossed and flooded. But John Newton survived. He had seen God in that storm, and when he got back home, he was so shaken that he turned away from that former life. He studied theology and became a priest. And later, as a parish rector, he was finally able to put into words his feelings of God's amazing grace towards him, a grace that allowed him to survive when so many others did not. A grace that granted him a chance to say to God, "Here am I, send me. Let me be a messenger for you." His words were joined to an existing hymn, and as part of the worship service on January the 1st, 1773, the song was first performed. And of course, it is spread around the world, delivering the message of God's forgiveness, mercy, and grace. Brother Lane Wilson of the Society of St. John the Evangelist has said, "Jesus comes to us now in the particularity of each moment and each circumstance, and waits for us to meet him. Look for him with open eyes. Hear him with open ears. Receive him with open hands, and engage him with an open heart. Pray for fresh encounters to meet him anew each day." Have you had an epiphany as you've come to know God? You may see God as a king on a throne, or as a blinding light, or in a storm, or in a mess of fish. I see God in the scampering squirrels, the golden glow of trees reflecting the setting sun, and in the excitement and joy on the face of a child as she first discovers that she can crawl. The Epiphany lesson for today is that Jesus is calling you to be his disciple. Like everything else in our understanding of God, it may not be what you expect. However, whenever, wherever you see God, answer the call with, "Here am I, send me." Show God's mercy to others. Be a messenger with your life by your actions. I will with God's help. Amen.